The moment that changed North American economic power did not happen in a trade war hearing, a White House briefing room, or a WTO dispute settlement panel. It happened in a Toronto conference center at a quarterly investor briefing, with the Prime Minister of Canada sitting in the front row and a railway CEO reading from a script that had been reviewed by corporate counsel, international trade lawyers, and Canadian regulatory specialists. The words were polite, commercial, and absolutely devastating. Within 72 hours, America's single largest lever in global grain markets had been crushed. Not by tariffs, not by sanctions, not by any measure the World Trade Organization has jurisdiction over, or any action the United States Trade Representative can challenge through any bilateral framework, by a coordinated operational restructuring announced by Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, two private companies, one surgical timing, and a legal architecture built to survive any challenge at any trade forum on Earth. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the details reveal a level of strategic coordination that no American trade response has a framework to address. The two railway announcements were released 72 hours apart, framed independently as operational efficiency and shareholder value optimization. Presented in pure business language that removes every legal handle American regulators would normally use to challenge a trade-motivated action. But the coordination was not coincidental. Industry press confirmed within days that Transport Canada had convened private meetings with the executive leadership of both railways through the preceding weeks. Meetings that were described by one participant as focused on national strategic alignment of private rail capacity with Canadian economic priorities. The framing was deliberate, the timing was choreographed, and every sentence in both announcements was reviewed to ensure that actions presented as routine commercial decisions could not be reinterpreted as coordinated government trade action. The result was two independent-looking corporate announcements that together accomplished what no Canadian government measure could legally have done. The priority restructuring was the first and most immediate change. Canadian National announced that priority access to Vancouver and Prince Rupert, the two Canadian Pacific ports that serve as the fastest rail-to-ship routes from North American grain belts to Asian buyers, would be reassigned according to a revised allocation framework that weights Canadian origin cargo, European and Asian-bound shipments on long-term contracts, and value-added processed agricultural products above undifferentiated American grain exports moving in traditional commodity volumes. Canadian Pacific Kansas City issued a parallel announcement for its Gulf Coast routing through the Kansas City Southern network, applying the same priority logic to southbound cargo flows. The practical effect was that American grain shippers who had operated for decades under informal understandings about railcar availability, scheduling priority, and port slot allocation discovered that those understandings no longer applied. Grain that used to move from Minnesota and the Dakotas to Pacific ports on a predictable schedule was now subject to a priority framework designed to maximize Canadian economic value, which by definition deprioritized American cargo. The restructuring did not refuse American grain, it simply moved American grain to the back of the line at the moment when the line mattered most. The rate restructuring was the second pillar, and the one that hit American grain exporter margins immediately. Both railways announced revised tariff schedules that maintained preferential pricing for Canadian origin grain moving within Canada, and for export cargo moving from Canadian points of origin, while applying materially higher rates to American cross-border movements that had historically been priced below Canadian internal rates. The rate differential was approximately 17% on Pacific-bound flows and 22% on Gulf-bound flows. Numbers that appear modest in isolation but that translate into per-bushel economics. American grain exporters cannot absorb at current commodity prices without either pricing themselves out of Asian markets or swallowing margins that would turn profitable contracts into losses. The third pillar was capacity reallocation, the physical assignment of rail cars, crew availability, and network slots, which both railways announced would be adjusted to reflect the new priority framework. American grain shippers received notification that railcar availability during the harvest window would be reduced by approximately 30% compared to prior years. That is the specific detail that transformed the announcement from a commercial adjustment into a harvest season crisis. And underlying all of this was the CPKC dimension, the single-line continental reach that Canadian Pacific Kansas City alone possesses since its 2023 merger with Kansas City Southern, which connects Canada, the United States, and Mexico on a single network that no American or Mexican railway can match, and which gives CPKC unique leverage over American grain exports to Mexican buyers, extending the Canadian restructuring into a third geography. But the most devastating element of what Canada's railways announced is not the action itself, it is the fact that American grain exporters have no practical alternative. The geographic reality starts with a fact that sounds counterintuitive to anyone who has not studied Pacific shipping routes. Canadian ports are closer to most Asian markets than any American West Coast port. Prince Rupert in northern British Columbia is approximately 2 full sailing days closer to Tokyo, Busan, and Shanghai than Los Angeles or Long Beach. Vancouver is approximately a day and a half closer. Those distances translate into fuel costs, charter costs, and delivery timelines that make Canadian ports the economically rational destination for North American grain bound for Asia. That is why roughly 60% of American grain exports to the Asia-Pacific market move through Canadian ports on Canadian rail through terminal infrastructure that Canadian companies operate. And the American alternatives, the American West Coast ports that would theoretically absorb the redirected volume, are already operating at capacity on container traffic, agricultural bulk cargo, and industrial shipping, with no physical ability to take on additional grain volumes in any meaningful time frame. The rail network reality compounds the port problem. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City operate extensively within the United States. Their track runs through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and continues south through CPKC's network to Texas, Louisiana, and into Mexico. Major American grain-producing regions are served primarily by Canadian-owned track. And the American alternatives, BNSF Railway, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, CSX, exist but cannot absorb the redirected volume at either the capacity or the pricing that Canadian rail has historically offered. The American Association of Railroads estimated that replicating Canadian rail capacity for American grain export flows would require approximately $300 billion in new infrastructure, investment, and between 15 and 20 years of construction timeline, assuming regulatory approvals, labor availability, and environmental permitting that do not currently exist. The harvest timing is what transforms the announcement from a commercial adjustment into an agricultural catastrophe. The announcement came 3 weeks before the earliest harvest activity in the American Midwest and 6 weeks before peak harvest, a window that leaves American farmers and grain exporters with almost no ability to reposition their marketing strategy. Grain storage capacity in the Midwest is finite, built around assumptions of normal throughput that included the Canadian rail option. Unsold grain cannot be held indefinitely without quality degradation and carrying cost accumulation. The cascade that follows, forced selling, is predictable. Farmers facing storage constraints sell at whatever prices domestic markets offer. Those prices collapse as supply outpaces immediate demand. Farm incomes fall in a matter of weeks. Loan covenants trigger at regional banks. And the political backlash arrives in the exact states where the current administration built its electoral margin. The White House reaction revealed something more damaging than the railway announcement itself. The administration did not have a response framework because they had never seriously considered that private Canadian infrastructure could be weaponized against American trade. Trump's public response came at a press gaggle in Pennsylvania, where he was asked a straightforward question by an agricultural trade reporter. His answer lasted more than 3 minutes and included a threat to nationalize railways that were already American-owned but not relevant to the Canadian action, a claim that the United States could order CN and CPKC to resume normal service that was immediately refuted by his own transportation secretary, a misidentification of Canadian Pacific Kansas City as a Mexican company, and a final assertion that we don't need Canadian railways, that was contradicted by every American grain industry association within hours. Truth Social posts in the following days demanded retaliation against Canadian Rail that trade lawyers pointed out has no available legal mechanism, because the railways are private Canadian corporations making operational decisions within their legal authority on infrastructure they own. Regarding cargo, they are not obligated to carry at any particular rate or priority. Behind the scenes, the scrambling was more consequential. The USDA convened an emergency grain export analysis task force that concluded significant loss of American market share in Asian grain markets is likely within the current and following marketing years, with no short-term federal policy response available. The Department of Transportation convened an emergency meeting with the CEOs of BNSF, Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, and CSX. The answer from every executive was the same: not at the volumes required, not at the margins Canadian Rail has been offering, and not within any time frame that would save the current harvest cycle. The Surface Transportation Board briefed White House staff on the legal limits of American regulatory authority over Canadian railway operations, producing the uncomfortable realization that American regulators have no jurisdiction over CN and CPKC operations, even on American soil, because the regulatory framework is built around domestic corporate registration rather than operational geography. The State Department cable traffic characterized the situation as unprecedented in modern trade relations and recommended against any public retaliatory framing because no available response would produce outcomes favorable to American interests. And then Canadian National's CEO stood at the quarterly investor briefing in Toronto and transformed what had been presented as a commercial restructuring into a historical declaration. The setting was CN's Investor Day. Every major rail analyst in the country was present. Representatives from every Canadian and several American pension funds, sovereign wealth fund delegates from 3 Asian economies, the entire North American agricultural trade press watching. The CEO of Canadian Pacific Kansas City sat in the front row as a visible sign of coordination between the two railways. And Mark Carney, the sitting Prime Minister of Canada, was seated in the same row. A Prime Minister does not attend a railway investor briefing unless the railway is announcing something larger than quarterly earnings. The address began with standard quarterly review. It pivoted into the operational restructuring rationale with precise commercial framing. It explained why the restructuring reflected sound shareholder value principles, why the capacity reallocation matched CN's highest margin customer relationships, and why the new priority framework was expected to produce sustained earnings growth. Every sentence was unchallengeable, because every sentence was true. This was, at the surface level, a well-run railway doing what well-run railways should do. And then Carney walked to the podium. He spoke briefly, measured and controlled, without performative gravity. He acknowledged the railway leadership, the shareholders, the analysts, the international delegates. He spoke about the Canadian government's commitment to supporting Canadian infrastructure companies in their pursuit of commercially rational decisions that serve Canadian economic interests, Canadian strategic priorities. And then he addressed the elephant in the room directly. "I want to be clear about a question that has been raised in commentary over the past several days," he said. "The question is whether Canadian railway companies have the right to allocate their private capacity according to their own commercial judgment, or whether they are obligated by tradition, by precedent, by the preferences of a foreign government, to prioritize the trade flows of another country over their own shareholders' interests." The room was absolutely silent. Let me give you the Canadian government's answer to that question, clearly and without qualification. Canadian railways are Canadian companies. They are regulated by Canadian law, owned by Canadian and international shareholders, and operated according to Canadian commercial principles. The decisions about which cargo moves on Canadian track, at what priority, at what rate, and to which destinations belong to Canadian railway management, with the full support of the Canadian government. Then Carney turned to look directly into the cameras, paused, and spoke the 12 words that are now quoted on every commodity trading floor, every grain cooperative boardroom, every agricultural trade publication, and every investment bank's research division on the continent. "The grain is American, the railway is Canadian, the decision is ours." The phrase trended globally within 4 minutes. Within the hour, it was the front-page headline on the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal's international edition, Bloomberg, the Globe and Mail, and every major business publication in Tokyo, Seoul, and Mumbai. International media called it the 12 words that ended the American assumption about continental rail. And then Warren Buffett broke his silence. Berkshire Hathaway owns BNSF Railway, acquired in 2010 for $44 billion. Buffett has spent 15 years studying North American rail economics from the inside as a direct competitor to the Canadian networks. His analysis carried weight no other commentator could match. "I have written for years that railways are among the deepest competitive moats in modern economics," Buffett began. "You cannot build a new transcontinental railway. The right-of-way does not exist. The capital required exceeds the gross domestic product of most nations. The regulatory barriers are insurmountable. What Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City hold in their network footprint is infrastructure that cannot be built around, competed away, or substituted through any action available to American policy. And they just exercise the leverage that every railway owner in the world knows the network confers." He continued, "Let me be clear. This is not a trade action by the Canadian government. This is a private sector commercial decision by 2 well-run Canadian railways. And the decision is both legally defensible and economically rational under any framework an investor like myself would apply. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City have allocated their scarce rail capacity to the traffic that produces the highest margins and the most strategic long-term customer relationships. That is precisely what any well-run railway should do for its shareholders. If I were sitting on either board, I would have voted for the same restructuring. The problem for American grain exporters is that their pricing power at American harvest was always subsidized by Canadian rail willingness to carry their cargo at rates that privileged American shippers. That willingness has ended. The implicit subsidy has ended, and the price discovery that follows will be painful, extended, and structurally permanent. His closing landed with deceptive simplicity. The railway is the moat just closed. The grain will flow where the railway permits, and the railway is not American. The game has changed, and it will not change back. The market consequences arrived within days. Wheat futures at Chicago and Minneapolis collapsed by more than 9% in the first trading session after the railway announcements. Soybean futures fell by nearly 7% as Chinese state buyers signaled they would shift incremental purchases toward Brazilian and Argentine suppliers who do not depend on Canadian rail. Corn futures dropped by 5% on weakening export demand forecasts. Japanese trading houses suspended American wheat contract negotiations. Korean importers made similar adjustments. Chinese state buyers pivoted sharply toward Brazilian suppliers. Indonesian and Vietnamese flour millers signed preliminary agreements with Australian wheat exporters. Indian pulse importers locked in Canadian and Australian supply. Each transaction was significant. The aggregate pattern, Asian agricultural supply chains reorganizing around reduced American exposure within days, represented the structural loss of market share that American grain exporters had assumed was secure. And the political fallout spread faster than the administration could contain. The Republican governor of Iowa held a press conference at a grain elevator and said Washington chose a confrontation with Canada that has produced direct harm to Iowa agriculture. The governor of Montana, a Republican who had campaigned explicitly on the administration's trade posture, said the trade strategy that was supposed to benefit Montana farmers has produced the opposite result. Republican senators from North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Montana issued statements ranging from measured concern to direct criticism. The Senate Agriculture's committee chair told reporters the committee would hold hearings to understand what options exist for federal support of American farmers during what appears to be a structural shift in export market access. The American Farm Bureau called for immediate diplomatic engagement. The National Grain and Feed Association demanded urgent administration action. Major grain trading CEOs, Cargill, ADM, Bunge, made rare public statements expressing concern. The industry had held its tongue through previous trade confrontations. It stopped holding its tongue when the railway action landed. So here is where we stand. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City executed a coordinated operational restructuring that destroyed America's single largest lever in global grain markets, redirected rail capacity away from American export flows, repriced every cross-border grain shipment, and locked American grain exporters out of the Asian market access they had built their strategy around for 30 years. The legal framework is unchallengeable. The timing was surgical. American grain futures collapsed. Asian buyers reoriented toward Australian and Argentine suppliers. Farm Belt governors and senators broke publicly with the White House, and the administration discovered that the response tools it assumed were available, tariffs, trade sanctions, regulatory retaliation, simply do not apply to private Canadian railway operational decisions on infrastructure Canada built. While American policy was paying attention to other matters, Mark Carney sat in the front row at Canadian National's investor briefing, looked directly into the cameras, and spoke 12 words that are now quoted on every commodity trading floor on the continent. The grain is American. The railway is Canadian. The decision is ours. And Warren Buffett, the one investor in the world who owns a competing American railway, delivered the assessment that closed the